So I'm going to turn over remote control to Chris McMurray to start our next discussion, which is about the new digital learning experience standards. It's the workshop on the new model of instructional design and dictionary definitions. So Chris, you have remote control now to these slides.
Okay, perfect. Let's see if that works. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, it's working. Yeah.
Sort of.
Okay, good. Well, over to you. And I think you were going to make another comment too on what Kimberly was talking about. And
oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. So Kimberly, I love the concept of having that wallet. And one of the things that I was interested in sort of, or curious about was sort of the other aspects beyond just sort of the academic sort of credentials. What sort of other SEL components might show up in that type of a CV that would help learners as they've transitioned from place to place or experience to experience. And that's another aspect of that I thought was super strong. Love that conversation. So my name is Chris McMurray. I'm one of the EduJedi and with the Learning Counsel and have been in a very recent life an assistant superintendent in a fairly large system and working through all these things and making sure that I'm picking up bits and pieces of wisdom along the way. And so what I'm here to share today is really, as Lonnie was mentioning, some ideas around how we address selection and evaluation of resources, and then apply those within an ecosystem. And I'm going to be skipping over the top, but I know that there are 2 sessions following mine that are really intended for us to have a deeper conversation about stuff that might be meaningful as you hear it. So there's plenty of time after this for asking lots of questions. And while I would love to see stuff in the chat, for sure, reach out and throw your questions in there, and we can talk about them as we go. So really, this is as you can see in this slide, what we're really talking about is moving beyond digital literacy, right? And so we're talking about a learning experience, and we're talking about leveraging the internet, leveraging the digital forms of things that we have today. All of the digital versus digitized aspects and characteristics of resources, and then how do we move that into a system that allows for teachers and more importantly students to be at the center of a design and of an experience. And so we're gonna dig in a little bit more on that. And oops, weird. My control is not working. Sorry, excuse me for not being able to control that. Oh, there we go. So I'm gonna jump into this graphic here, and I want to start out by sort of setting some context for identifying digital curriculum. Whoops. Ooh. Hey, Lonnie, are you? If you're still on, I'm experiencing some technical difficulties with advancing slides remotely.
Yeah, I'm on. I'm gonna remove you from being remote controller.
Okay.
And I'll remote control from here as I listen to you.
Perfect. Sounds good.
Okay, so we're on this one, right?
We're back a step. We're on digital characteristics. There we go. Yep. So
Okay.
So the graphic that you're looking at now really was developed back in 2015 by the Learning Counsel, and really it had a scale that was really designed to start to identify and help people think through, what am I really using as I create an experience for students? And this is important because it really is the first time that we start to acknowledge what is the range and scope of things that we're trying to do in terms of applying technology within the learning space. And so as you see here, this really begins to explain that, and there's a critical juncture tied to the arrows at the very top, and those arrows really indicate that on one end of the scale we're using things that require much more teacher time or planning, and on the other side of the scale we allow more automation. And so, for example, the digital document down there in the bottom left, that's kind of at the low end of sophistication, right? And as we talk about resources that we could use to build an experience that are highly engaging and meaningful to the learner, that's kind of low. That's kind of low on the totem pole, right? It's just not that sophisticated. That's a Google Doc. It's a Word doc. It's just something that it's static. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't really interact with anything, and much less the human on the other side of it. And so as you move up into some other levels of sophistication, you start bumping into things like single loop animations, and those are like PowerPoints that have things flying in and out of corners and things like that. Those are all very sort of rudimentary motions, but starting to move up. They're inching up the scale of engagement, moving into video, which might be like a teacher that creates a video that the students can then stop or fast forward or pause or rewind or really anything that they need to in order to actually start to engage with the content. And that's sort of the first time that we start to see objects, learning objects, that have the ability to interact with the user, right, with the learner. And so for example, then you're moving up into collections, and those collections could be searchable. You see these things where there's discrete bits of content that's built into a collection of resources. You can search for something like world history, and it's going to bring you back various paragraphs of text and some pictures and some videos and things like that. And that's all great because you get to sort of decide what pieces of content you want within that learning object. And there's a lot of those out there, and they're doing a great job of making it easy to find stuff and easy to find information. So as a learning designer, you would want to start including more of those more sophisticated types of resources that are going to allow you to create a deep experience. So that's kind of a breaking point where those collections no longer need to be curated by you as the teacher. That's something that we're allowing the machine to do. The machine does it well, and all I have to do now is apply that and build with it. It's like Lego. And so we sort of cross a line with interaction and allowing the automation to be more meaningful into that feedback loop, sort of a category. And once we get into that feedback loop, that's actually automating things inside apps and inside resources that allow interaction with the student by answering questions, for example, or giving feedback, or intervening and moving a learner into a slightly different path based on what they're doing. And that's a point where all of a sudden, if you're using elements like that in your learning design, that frees you up as a teacher to do the more human things, right? So the relationship is still key, right? And how do we, what people have been struggling with through the virtual learning sort of a shift is that relationship. How do we maintain the humanity in the experience? And using more sophisticated stuff allows you to do that. And so we move into the coding level, and this is not very sophisticated coding. This is like teacher using WordPress to create a web page, all the way up into a very highly designed courseware. And that highly designed courseware is kind of the golden egg, right? That's like this mystery level where the adaptability and the ability for the machines to predict what it is that you're going to need based on what you're doing and where you're going, really, really opens up a world of learning for the end user. And so as you consider what are you starting to put in and what have you put into your ecosystem, if you're like a lot of systems early on in your transformation, you just loaded up the system with stuff. And there's a bunch of things out there, and now you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I evaluate that stuff, and how do I know which things are most meaningful and which ones have the most instructional capacity, for example, which ones have controls, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and which ones create a world that's immersive. Because if you're using those sophistication levels, then you're not having kids staring at a screen. You're actually causing interaction and some engagement. So that's an important sort of context for you to understand, and it's going to help you to start to evaluate some of the resources that you're trying to get into your ecosystem. So from there, there we go. From there, in terms of evaluating digital objects, it's also important not only to understand sort of the sophistication scale, but you also want to start to think through how are the digital learning objects how are they created in relation to aggregation, right, or granularity? And so this isn't a brand new object scale, learning object scale. This came out in the special report that's pictured there on the screen, and so this helps us to understand. For example, on the very top, you have aggregated to disaggregated levels of content, and so at the very top you have a very granular level, which would be the concept level, and that's really just a discrete piece of information, right? It's a scrap from an old textbook. It's a paragraph from a biology text that someone sort of typed into a system. It could be created by a teacher. It could be virtually anything, right? But very discrete and very small, and it's really not connected to anything. And so that's fine. But again, it's on the low end of the sophistication scale. And so then you move up into contextualized content, which then places that piece of biology into a larger collection of things that are connected conceptually, and then the learner can use any piece of those up into courses in ebooks, and that's where you start to see aggregation, and you start to see collections being created around concepts that are connected, but are also navigable. And so that's a much more immersive and sophisticated level of learning object. And then you move up into sort of the applet professionally coded, right? The ones above are amateur types of authorware. Those are things that might be created by teachers even, right? So an ebook can be created by a teacher. Into the more professionally coded, right? So we move from short form to long form professionally coded applications. And at the low end of that sophistication scale is the applet, or the app, right? That's the short form. It's a discrete application that works on one concept. Maybe it's a math application. It's not very deep. It doesn't have a whole lot of modular ability, and it really is designed to do one thing, and that's it, right? And you're not going to be immersed in this thing. It's just going to be one thing, and you're probably going to be done. Up into courses, right, and courseware, and those are much more gamified. You're starting to see things like gating being used. You're starting to cause interaction and decisions made with the learner. The app is giving some feedback. The app is really starting to interact with the learner a little bit more, and making some predictions and helping the learner to get there. And then you move up into the higher ends of those coursewares and collection types of learning objects, which are really starting to, and this is cool, it's really starting to engage the AR and AI, right, and VR and all of the machine learning that we use out there in the rest of the world. It's also applicable here in the education world, as it should be. And this is where, again, if you're designing with those types of learning objects, wow, you're putting together a powerful experience for the learners. And that's really where it's going to take some understanding of those things, so that you're not building a learning experience using those short form apps and those concept level content items, because that's a dead end, right? That's not going to be a very engaging experience for the end user. So this is another piece of background information that's important for us to all understand as we evaluate and figure out what it is that we're using. So from that point, there we go. From that point, the Learning Counsel took a look at what was going on in the world in terms of this app Circus, right? And we've all experienced that in some measure as we've connected with technology within our own systems. And so from my own experience, it was great to see ClassLink come up before, because there was light at the end of the tunnel when ClassLink showed up in my district, and we started conversations with them, because literally it was we had a lot of apps, we had a ton of stuff out there, and there wasn't a whole lot of understanding about what was good and what was bad and what fits and what doesn't fit, and we were just at the very beginning, right? And so what was being experienced was this manic sort of pace, and this sea of stuff that was all fairly good, right? I mean, all of those apps were great, they're fine. And so the Learning Counsel took a look at that and listened and watched. and came up with some thinking around that. And this is actually this is pivotal, because if you look at the stair-step graphic in there in the very center, and there's a lot to look at there, but focusing on that, what you see is sort of a snapshot of what a system might look like, right? And you're jumping between grade levels, and as you jump between those grade levels, you see that the items and the objects, the learning objects, are shifting and changing, and that's tiny, right? There's only 4 there, but what you're experiencing as a teacher and as a system administrator and as a teaching and learning person, you're experiencing this massive amount of information and resource out there, and then you've got to make sense of it. And how do you even know what's good? And so this was being felt by folks all across the country. And what was recognized was that this is a digital load, right? This represents some complexity and some volume, which then sits on top of the job of an educator, because then you're trying to vet this stuff, right? At the same time, it's like writing. I'm not a unicycle rider, nor would I ever profess to be, and I can't juggle. But if somebody asked me to ride a unicycle and juggle at the same time, that's not going to be pretty. Somebody's going to video that and post it very quickly, and it's going to be very entertaining, but it's going to be a mess. And so this really was the first time that somebody said, "Hey, wait a minute, guys, we've got all this stuff." And what we've done inadvertently is to add load. We added a digital load, which is almost unwieldy, and it is in a lot of systems. And it was then identified that a piece that was missing was actually some of the routing, right, and some of the logistics that go along with a system that has that many working components. Really has to have something that sits on top of that and goes, okay, yep, so these pieces are going here and these are going there and these are good. Let's take those out and put this other one in. And guess who does that really well? Humans can, but machines do it really well, and they automate that. And so this was actually a really sort of another pivotal moment in understanding what it is that we're purporting to move forward with. And really helps to take some of the weight off and allow us to go, okay, yeah, so that's what it is. That's what what I've been feeling? That's what I've been feeling. And so if we add those logistics steps, excuse me, then we're talking about actually breaking through into something new. So that's important to understand and acknowledge that, yes, we've created this. This load. So I'm going to hop back into the dictionary. And if you haven't downloaded the dictionary, absolutely go do that. But I want to breeze through some of the categories, and then I'll show some of the examples of the definitions as we go. So all of the different categories are relatively self-explanatory, but I'm going to go through kind of what's covered in each one, so that as you're out there meandering through, it's a great read on a Wednesday night, for sure. I highly recommend it. So for example, the actions category really talks about things that are code-based, right? So the functions of the code, what do they do? Generally, what are they doing with and without involvement with other processes? But that's sort of the category that talks about those things. Design really digs into things around aesthetics or navigation or interoperability or user onboarding, things like that. User options, accessibility and engagement strategies and things like that are all covered in that design area. The controls are really actually very critical, right? So controls is relative to administrative capabilities, and so these are all the things that allow you to customize the experience and shift and tweak the resource, and that's important, right? You have to understand as you're selecting resources, do I have the controls that I need to have in order for me to make this resource work well within my ecosystem? And that's talked about in there. The customization connected to that, right? It's functions that support decisions to match the needs of learners, right? So we're talking about individualization and personalization, and as I say that, I want to make sure that we understand that individualization is referenced to decisions that educators make for learners, and that personalization in that regard refers to models where learners have options to decide what methods or materials that suit their needs, and it's perfect. It's a perfect dovetail to the personalized pathway discussion that we just had with Randa. We are moving toward personalization. We have to be, and if your system's not, it should be. So all of that is covered under customization. Instruction is also important because you want to understand what are the lesson giving qualities within a learning object. How is the content delivery, tutoring, feedback to support student understanding, things like that. That's all talked about in that section. Mechanisms is really digital structures that create a series of steps, right? You could say it's a series of actions that are built as a small system. It works in sequences or loops, and that's all defined in there. Business model is important. I talked to a colleague recently, and he was lamenting that his team hadn't really dug in on a lot of these definitions, and didn't really understand the business model of the resources that they were suggesting or recommending that they put into the system. And that's a bummer because, as we know, freemium's not free, right? Someone's getting that stuff on the other side, and we need to understand that, because that impacts the experience if you use things that learning objects that you haven't considered that in. And then things like hostile characteristics. These are characteristics and applications that are intrusive, right? And it's intentionally intrusive. There are those pop-ups that say, "Hey, upgrade your system for whatever, $29.99," and then every fifth grader goes, "Sure, I want to do that." And then you click on it, and then you got mud. And then the last one is really sort of a catch-all. It's terms and ideas that are important to understand, basics and not so basics. And so that those are the categories within the dictionary. A couple of examples. This one is of Gigi the penguin, whom I love a lot, and many kids in the world do. Gigi teaches math without words, not even penguin words. And so that relates to spatial temporal reasoning. And that is, as you can see here, the intentional non-use of language, right? So that's fantastic, but it's also important to understand when you as a teaching and learning person are sitting down arm in arm with your compatriot on the IT side and going, well, let's look at this product and what are the instructional qualities within it? That's one of them. And both of you need to understand that. You got to be on the same page with that. But that's a good example of what other things you'll find in there. We've got things like there's the hostile characteristics that I mentioned before, right? They're intrusive, they're cookies, they're ads you don't want kids to see. And that's important to understand, again, because on one hand, you might go, oh, well, we can just ignore those. Well, no, actually you can't, because along the path of learning, if you've designed with a resource that has hostile characteristics in it and you didn't know, then in the middle of a fantastic experience, up pops a window or something that you didn't really intend for a student to see, and then they're off. That's a left turn. They've gone down the rabbit hole, and then hauling them back from that. Yep. Good luck. Modal, another example. So this is a dialog box, right? It forces interaction. It forces some decision making before you move forward. It's not a pop-up, but it's actually part of the code. It's part of the resource and experience, and it's important. And you need to know this, right? These are things that we all have to understand on all sides of the learning support system in order to make sure that we can build things that are the highest level of experience. So modals are important to understand. Another one, this is actually very critical, right? Nesting. Not only do we need to understand that the resources that we have make our information easy to get to, but it's also a concept that relates to some standards for educators, for teachers, in fact, about how to make information easy to access, because it's important. If you can't get to it, it's not going to be used. It's pretty simple. So those are some examples. I'm going to hop into standards for administrators and teachers very quickly. And this is important because the standards for administrators, for sure. I mean, we've talked about standards for teachers, but in this regard, standards for administrators really hasn't been addressed. And it's critical that we as central office administrators and building administrators understand that we have a responsibility to know all of those things and look at that dictionary and understand deeply what it is that I'm trying to do, because you do have responsibility for selection and management of digital curriculum and systems. You just do. So there's some examples here that I'll share with you, just a few, but there's more in the dictionary. So for example, impacting the impacts of a free resource or actual cost for a resource, right? There's often some hidden things that you didn't think about. It's kind of like purchasing a new paper curriculum and not thinking about the consumables, but thinking about licensing, right? Legal language, guess what? Teaching and learning people, you got to know that stuff. You do, and you can't just pass it off to your legal team. You have to know those things, and you have a responsibility to. And guess what? There's some standards you can use to make that work a little more manageable. Progressively working toward full individualization and personalization. Again, like I mentioned before, if you're not, get there. Move toward personalization, because that's the end, right? And we have the technology now to go do that in a way that we haven't before. So those are just some examples of standards for administrators. We're going to continue to work on those as we go through this year and moving into the next. And so there's some standards for teachers as well that sort of parallel those, right? They're layers. And this really speaks to a teacher's responsibility for composition in systems, for learning design and for student oversight within that system. And I want to focus on learning design quickly, because what we should be spending our time doing is designing for learning and not designing for teaching, and that's a critical distinction. So there's a few examples that I want to share that are going to be in the dictionary, but they do relate to understanding. Before we get into the standards for students, they do relate to understanding of a resource that you're using in the design that promotes creation, right, and promotes that critical thinking. Those are all things that we've been addressing as teachers outside of technology, and now we have responsibility within the digital context. So another layer, standards for students, also focused on what is your student as responsibility as a student regarding interface and your experience with digital content. That's important to understand, and I know that we're running short of time here. So understand that those are all in progress, and what I would like to throw out there to anybody attending today is sort of an invitation to add some input and be connected to this conversation, because we need information and we want to make sure that we're keeping it real. So what we're looking at here is another component of this, right? And this is a model that was designed around a student experience versus a teaching experience. And so what you see on here at the very top is Addie's model, and Addie's is fine, right? Addie's is a fine model. It's 45-ish years old, and it was designed around what a teacher does, and it was designed around teacher created something, and it doesn't really go into depth in terms of addressing what the student experience might be, and what is the student's component of that experience as they move through it, and that's an important distinction to make. But what you see here is that there are some differences, and I'll go through those in just a moment. But you see some alignment here where we've got analysis versus scope and discovery. So the EduJedi model is broken into logistics, workflow, logistics design, and then discovery design. And the discovery design is where students are pushed for questioning. They're coming up with the questions, right? They're discovering and uncovering things, and so that's where the learning gets sticky, right? And whereas in the workflow we're talking about, well, what's the path, and how do we create multiple paths, and how do we help people move around? So I want to highlight a few of the definition or a few of the differences between these two models before we jump into some other stuff. And so as you think about ways that the model is different than Addie's, for example, the EduJedi model really detaches those assumptions of place, time, and teacher centricity, right? And that's where we start moving into personalized learning, and we start to think about breaking down sort of traditional barriers of time, place, space, and pace. And now with some logistics capacity, we can do that much more easily. It's easier for us to go there. So for example, it also talks for or allows for goal setting that isn't restricted to course or class framework. And that's important as we start to break down the walls, thinking through some of the hybrid models that are out there currently, really starts to poke at seat time. Right, and some logistics-based types of questions that we haven't had to deal with yet, and now we really need to. So it talks about automated synchronicity. We're talking about connectivity between academic standards and pacing guides, and that's not brand new, but in the context of a digital experience, yep, it's having something that is at the depth of what we're talking about, yes. Talking about problems posed by the students or identified by the students versus posed by the designer. That's another distinction. Looking at autonomy, right, and moving into student agency is important, and this set of this model really speaks to that. So if you're going to design some learning that moves toward personalization, this is the model to use. So there's many more, and I know that we're bumping into some time for some deeper discussion, and I would love to get some questions and commentary on what you just heard. But it's a ton of information, and we wanted to glance over the top and hopefully pique your interest, and see if we can engage some folks in a lively discussion.
Yeah, that was rapid fire. That was awesome, Chris.
Well, sorry,
you got through all of that in half an hour. Was amazing. I think I gave some of the data early on yesterday for this regional event. But we are at time. So we're not going to take questions right now. We're just going to have you sort of mull in this.
Sure.
Go and download it. And then online, like Chris said, there is a place on the Learning Counsel site where you can volunteer for all of the EduJedi meetings. I think when we first started inviting people, we had one superintendent volunteer for every single meeting. Every meeting is on a section of everything that Chris just talked about. So you can talk about just the actions, get in that meeting and really dive into learning about it, and then make all of your comments and what else needs to be in there, and like just contribute, be a good EduJedi. And then also the model, there's a whole contest that's going to be run this year. So please do volunteer. But thank you, Chris. That was awesome.
Yep,
I wish I could talk as fast as you. So
it's a curse.
So, yeah. So, all right. Well, thanks. I'm